when we look at Matthew 24, what makes it very challenging is that some of the things that Jesus talks about, from our perspective today, have been fulfilled, but some have not. And so, again, the preterist would agree with that as well. And so we're both agreeing that the question we need to ask when we read this is, okay, every time we encounter something Jesus says, we have to ask the question, was this fulfilled in the past or not? And specifically when we say the past, we're talking about one major event which took place in the year 70 AD, which is when the Roman military leader Titus was sent in to squash a Jewish rebellion. And that actually took place over several years, but in the year 70 AD was when Jerusalem itself was sieged and destroyed. The siege lasted for 5 months. And it was awful. Hundreds of thousands of people died. And Josephus writes about this in his famous book called The Jewish Wars. And he describes the whole thing because, again, just the siege of Jerusalem was one part of it. But then if you've ever heard of Masada, that happened a few years later.
Hey, welcome to Whitefields Community Church Sermon Extra. Great to have you with us once again this week. We're back. We've been away for a while, a couple weeks maybe. Here and there and everywhere, conferences, traveling, those kind of things. I'm here with Pastor Nick Cady once more, and he's pastor here at Whitefields Community Church here in Longmont, Colorado, and we are in our series, Behold Your King, and we are in the exciting chapters of chapter 24, 25, the Olivet Discourse, and so we're going to be discussing that today a little bit, get you all caught up on where we are and what we've been looking at and it's going to be a good time as we go through this. But just as you're watching now, if you missed that sermon on Sunday, or I think a couple weeks ago when we jumped in the first 14 verses, then get over whitefieldschurch.com. You can download it there and get caught up. And you definitely want to get caught up because you don't want to miss any of this. It's important stuff. And, especially as we see, what's going on in the world today and things like that. And how are we to react and how are we to be as Christians? And a lot of that is addressed in these sermons. And so you definitely want to get there. whitefieldschurch.com. Of course, our app, you can get that on Apple, Google Play, Apple Store, App Store, whichever one of those is your favorite. And then, of course, you're watching us YouTube and Facebook. Thumbs up, any kind of interaction, and subscribe. If not subscribed, get subscribed. We're trying to get to 1,000 subscribers. That would be great. So if you haven't done that, do it now. Just hit that button, subscribe. It's right there. And then, of course, any of your favorite podcasting apps, rate and review. Any kind of interaction you have with us is certainly going to help. That's how you can help us and get any of this content that people asking questions about the Olivet Discourse, Jesus' return, all of these things. What does this all mean? It's this video right now, this podcast is going to show up in their search engine, and we'll be able to provide them, hopefully, with Christ-centered and gospel-centered answers to their questions. And so let's just dive right in. Chapter 24, we have gone through now the first 31 verses, and we kind of want to look at, so there are different ways that people look at this particular chapter, these two chapters, the Olivet Discourse, kind of what we talked about. There's kind of three different ways. There's two main views. It's the futurist, and then the preterist view, and then what we call the idealist view. And so maybe you want to just kind of define those three terms, and then I guess the rest of the video we're going to spend kind of looking at the preterist view and then kind of the view that you took on Sunday morning. Yeah.
Okay, so you wanted me to define those terms? Okay,
yeah, I think that'd be good, yeah.
So the terms kind of go like this. You have what's called a futurist viewpoint. Now, what's important to mention is that really where these come into play isn't just in regard to this passage, but it's in regard to the eschatological passages in the New Testament, of which there are several. The main ones being the Olivet Discourse, which is found in 3 of the 4 Gospels, and the book of Revelation. But then you also bring in stuff like 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 and a few other passages that could go in there, as well as, importantly, Daniel chapter 12. Yeah. Like, how does Daniel chapter 12 fit into all of this? And actually also Daniel chapter 11. So the futurist viewpoint says that the majority of things talked about in the Olivet Discourse and the book of Revelation are yet to come. Now, it's not all of it's yet to come, right? We would look at that and say, from this verse on, for example, is how we would do it in both the Olivet Discourse and in Revelation. And then on the other hand, you have the preterist viewpoint. The preterist viewpoint is saying that, again, the majority, not all, the majority of these things that are talked about in Matthew 24 and in the book of Revelation have already taken place. And then they would draw a line somewhere else and say, now from this point on, everything else is future. And I would say that these views, it's important to understand, they exist on a continuum, meaning that certain preterists, some people will say, well, I'm preterist, about these verses. I believe these things happened already and these things didn't. Then you have the idealist viewpoint, which actually doesn't really come into play here in Matthew 24. Idealists kind of go back and forth between having a futurist view of Matthew 24 and having a preterist view. They can kind of go either way. But it really comes into play when it gets into the book of Revelation. What's the purpose of it? They also, these views also see Revelation primarily as one thing, right? So Revelation is, it is a prophecy, it is apocalyptic, and it is a letter. And so you could say that each of these three hermeneutical frameworks, or frameworks for interpretation of these passages, views it as primarily one of those things. So the idealist views it primarily as an apocalyptic writing. The preterist views it primarily as a prophecy which was fulfilled. The futurist views it as a prophecy and a letter primarily. So how does that apply to Matthew 24? Well, I mentioned several times during the message on Sunday that when we look at Matthew 24, what makes it very challenging is that some of the things that Jesus talks about, from our perspective today, have been fulfilled, but some have not. And so, again, the preterist would agree with that as well. And so we're both agreeing that the question we need to ask when we read this is, okay, every time we encounter something Jesus says, we have to ask the question, was this fulfilled in the past or not? And specifically when we say the past, we're talking about one major event which took place in the year 70 AD, which is when the Roman military leader Titus was sent in to squash a Jewish rebellion. And that actually took place over several years, but in the year 70 AD was when Jerusalem itself was sieged and destroyed. The siege lasted for 5 months. And it was awful. Hundreds of thousands of people died. And Josephus writes about this in his famous book called The Jewish Wars. And he describes the whole thing because, again, just the siege of Jerusalem was one part of it. But then if you've ever heard of Masada, that happened a few years later. That was kind of the final holdout where they had gone up to this place that was built by King Herod the Great, this great fortress.
Yeah, I've been up there. It's absolutely amazing.
And what's, to me, the most amazing part of it is that they go up to this place, they live there for a couple of years. It's like their final holdout. And then the Romans, did you notice this when you were there? They built slowly this like land bridge.
And I mean, imagine like every day, every month, every year, this thing gets closer and closer.
I know, you're just like watching them get closer. Yeah.
But yeah, it's pretty amazing to be up there.
And they had taken some of the scrolls from the temple. Well, maybe someone from the temple prior to that, but they had taken some scrolls of the books of the Bible. So when we have Dead Sea Scrolls, yes, we're talking about the Dead Sea Scrolls that were found at Qumran, which is down south of Jericho. But also we have some that were found at Masada because they had taken them and kind of like squirreled them away into holes. And they weren't found until 2,000 years later, which is amazing. Wow. But all that to say, that was in like the year 70. It was after the destruction of Jerusalem. I don't want to make up numbers, but it was around 72 or after. So the point is, are the things that Jesus is talking about here, which things happened in 70 AD and which didn't? And so I want to just say that the person who holds the preterist viewpoint, I don't think that they're foolish. I don't think they're wrong. In fact, that's a historically held viewpoint that's been held for many years. But here's what my point would be as a futurist. I would say it was not held by the earliest Christian writers for the first few centuries, the church fathers. Specifically, we have multiple church fathers writing about how they believe that the Antichrist and the abomination of desolation, these are all future things, and the return of Christ predicted in Matthew 24. So let me just kind of give you the key hermeneutical, what we would call the hermeneutical key for a person who believes that all the things Jesus talks about here have already been fulfilled. And that is in something in Matthew 24 where he says that it's in the lesson of the fig tree.
Verse 34,
Verse 34, he says, this generation will not pass away until all these things have taken place. The question, which things is he talking about? The things going all the way back to the beginning of chapter 24? Or is he referring to, as I would believe, the abomination of desolation? That when the abomination of desolation takes place, that's what he's talking about.
And the generation, I think that's important, defining which generation as well. That's also brought up for debate. Is it the generation that is right now that Jesus is speaking to, or is this generation that will witness the abomination of desolation?
Yeah, and another reason why, and this is kind of like a good point that actually lends itself towards this viewpoint, is that in the end of chapter 23, Jesus had said that this generation would see these things. That's in chapter 23, verse 36. Truly, all these things will come upon this generation. Well, what things? The judgment of Jerusalem. And that does happen within 40 years after Jesus says these things. Jerusalem's destroyed. The temple's destroyed. So the question is the destruction of the temple a separate event from the other things Jesus talks about? And I personally believe that it is, and there are several reasons. I laid out some of them on Sunday, but I'll tell you that what happens is that somebody who says, well, all these things, they interpret Matthew 24, verse 34, this generation, they say that's the generation that Jesus was speaking to. He's saying your generation will not pass away until all these things happen. So they are therefore forced to find a way to place all the things that come before this in Matthew 24 in 70 AD. Now, again, let me just reiterate, that was not the view held by the earliest Christian writers who were closest to these events. This is something that happens later on, right? Another thing that happens is because they would agree with what I said on Sunday, that the Great Tribulation is described in Revelation 6 through 19. Well, then they would say, well, then Revelation 6 through 19 must be describing what happened in 70 AD. And so,
apocalyptic language.
In apocalyptic language. So then they would say, well, the problem with that is that historically, even, again, from the church fathers, they tell us, even Eusebius, the church historian, tells us that Revelation was written in the 90s AD, and he tells us that by telling us who the Roman emperor was at that time, that John had been on Patmos, who it was who put John on Patmos, when John got released from Patmos, and it was at the death of a particular Roman emperor who lived 30 years after, 20-something years after the destruction of Jerusalem. So that, in other words, they have to redate the book of Revelation to the 60s AD in order for Revelation, which refers to itself as a prophecy. John says, Jesus says to John in Revelation, write down the words of this prophecy. So in order for Revelation to be a prophecy, they have to make the dating of Revelation, the writing of it, earlier than 70 AD, which again contradicts the writings of the early church fathers who tell us when Revelation was written. So to me, this is what happens when you use one hermeneutical key, but it forces you to do things which, in my opinion, lead to a very unnatural reading. It leads to what we might call shoehorning things into your framework. And I think that they have to do that several times, which is why I don't hold that view. Okay, so why do I hold a futurist view? Number one, I hold it because it was held by the earliest church fathers. I also think it's the plain reading of the text. And it does create certain problems. I'll admit that. But I like how one commentator put it. I read, of course, I've read about this for years, actually. Taught a class on this recently at our Bible Learning Center. But one writer he said, well, both interpretive frameworks have problems. I just like my problems better than I like your problems, right?
Yeah.
So
because we are literally talking about future events.
yeah.
So I mean, in a sense, we can, as you said, we have problems, but we're literally talking about things that are going to happen, and we are trying to somehow figure that out. And that, that's always going to create problems. We're trying to think about things that are going to happen in the future and try and what are they going to look like?
Right. Like so, Yogi Berra said, predictions are hard, especially when they're about the future.
Yeah.
So that's true.
Yeah.
Okay.
The quote of the day.
Yeah. All right. So let me just walk you through a few ways that somebody who believes that all these things happen in 70 AD, how they would explain them. Just try and give them the best hearing we can.
Yeah.
We'll call it steel manning the argument, right? So they would say, Jesus is saying verses 3 through 7, he's talking about things that are going to happen within the next 40 years until the destruction of Jerusalem. Wars, rumors of wars, etc., nation rising against nation, false Christs, that's later on, and then you will be delivered to tribulation. All these things, of course, did happen. But the thing is, they also continue to happen throughout history. And I would say earthquakes, rumors of wars, these things, I wouldn't say that they severely ramped up during that 40-year period. I think they always existed, and they existed then. And Jesus was kind of saying, these things alone are not the signs, but cumulatively, collectively, you will expect to see an increase of these things over time, an increase in frequency and intensity.
Yeah.
So I don't think that alone gives us any information, but then the abomination of desolation. So this is one I talked about. I said, well, nothing that meets that criteria was done in 70 AD. Now, what does the person who says, no, it did happen in 70 AD, what do they say? Well, what they say is that the abomination of desolation standing in the holy place, what they believe is that these were the Roman flags, or standards is what they're called, which were held up on poles in the city of Jerusalem. So in other words, they're redefining the holy place, which is a term used throughout the Bible to describe the first section of the inside of the temple. They're using that term now, giving it a different meaning. They're saying that, no, Jerusalem itself is the holy place. Now, here's why I disagree with that. First of all, it's not the natural reading of the text. Here's the other reason. Roman standards were held up in Jerusalem for many years prior to that, right? Jerusalem had been occupied. There was a praetorium right next to the Temple Mount. This was certainly not the first time that Roman standards had been elevated in Jerusalem. They've been elevated in Jerusalem the entire time, right? So how is this anything new? How is this anything different? And also, the Romans didn't actually enter the temple, as we know from Josephus's writings. The people fled to the temple, they burned it from the outside. The burning from the outside caused the gold, either that was plated on the outside or that was on the roof, to melt in between the stones, which is why the Romans disassembled it stone by stone. Okay, so all that's where I think you really are shoehorning now when you're saying that the abomination of desolation wasn't what Daniel said it was, which is an effigy or
a statue,
or some symbol,
some idol,
something that defiles the temple,
and the holy of holies.
And so I don't think that we can. I really think that's a stretch to say that. Here's the next one. The next part though does make sense, right? It's written specifically to residents of Judea and Jerusalem. Run to the hills. There would be no point in doing that if he's talking to the whole world. Right. Why is he talking specifically to Jerusalem? Now, from a futurist viewpoint, we would say, well, I guess if this is still in the future, it's speaking about something that's going to happen centered around Jerusalem. And Luke says that Jerusalem will be surrounded by armies. Certainly that happened in 70 AD, but will it happen again? Well, I would say yes, of course, it can certainly happen again, and it wouldn't even be surprising given our current...
And it did in the 70s. The Six-Day War, all this, it's surrounded by armies. Even now surrounded. Well, Syria is not really much of an army.
Right. Well, it could be again, and it wouldn't be surprising to see Jerusalem.
So we've seen it before, and we can see it again.
Yeah. Okay, one more thought on the abomination of desolation before we move on. In the intertestamental period, there was a time, which means the time after the book of Zechariah or Micah and the writing of Matthew. So it's 400 years. During that period, there was a Syrian occupation of Israel, and the leader was this guy named Antiochus Epiphanes. And Antiochus Epiphanes he not only occupied Jerusalem, but he brought a pig into the holy place and slaughtered a pig and defiled the temple on purpose. And a lot of people said, well, isn't that the fulfillment of Daniel's prophecy? Well, we could say yes, but here's the issue. Jesus then speaks about the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel, now here after that event as a future event. So we could say that was maybe a prefiguring of what is going to happen. We don't know exactly what will happen, but it'll be something that will, in the Jewish mind, defile the temple. And again, the problem here for us as a futurist would be, well, it requires a new temple to be built, and it's not there yet. And there's a lot of more implications I could get into, but I just think that that's important. So some people would say, well, just as Antiochus Epiphanes defiling the temple 200 years before Jesus was a prefiguring of the abomination of desolation, which is still yet to come, in the same way, the destruction of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple could be seen as a prefiguring of the destruction of Jerusalem and temple, which is going to happen yet in the future. Now, to be fair, a preterist might look at my view and say, well, that's a stretch. You think my thing is a stretch. Well, I think your thing is a stretch. And I say, fair. We're both stretching because predictions are difficult, especially when they're about the future. So, okay, here's another one. Then it talks about the return of Christ. And I got to be honest, this is where I think that the view which tries to say all of these things happened in 70 AD, this is where I think they're really stretching. Because what they say is that the coming of the Son of Man, which Jesus describes, it will be like, it won't be secret. It will be like lightning from east to west. All the nations of the world will see it and mourn. Well, they would say, well, that's just hyperbole. It's exaggeration. And what really it's talking about is the coming of the Roman army into Jerusalem. And they say that is the coming of that Christ came to bring judgment upon Jerusalem through the Roman army. And the Roman army is being talked about here as Christ coming. Okay, let me tell you why I disagree with that. First of all, he says that he's going to collect all the people from the four winds, from one end of the earth to the other, and he's going to come with the loud trumpet. Well, that's the same thing that's described, like at the end of time. Jesus is going to call his people together. And so what is this referring to? Oh, he's going to gather his elect, right? And then here's why I also don't think, as if I needed more proof, but I'll tell you more proof, is that in chapter 25, Jesus describes what will happen after the second coming of Christ. And he talks about judgment day and the separating of the sheep from the goats and the return of Jesus, just like the return of a king who's gone away to a far country and then come back. In other words, he's talking about it as the parousia, right? Meaning, which is the Greek term for the arrival or the coming of Jesus, meaning the second coming. So, in other words, I just don't think that this is what it's talking about. I don't think it's talking about the Roman army coming into Jerusalem when it says that Christ is coming in a way that's visible, like lightning in the sky for people of all nations. I don't think that has happened yet. And again, I would reiterate, the early church fathers did not believe that had happened either. Oh, okay. So then, the big problem for the futurist is the verse 34. What does it mean? All these things will take place in this generation. And there have been several views, or several ideas put forward. Some futurists had seen this as seeing Israel rebirth as a nation, and then the generation which would live after that. And then different, numbers were given for how long a generation is. I personally don't take that view. Here's the view I take. He's talking about a fig tree. In other words, if you see a fig tree blossom, well, it's not going to snow soon. In fact, that summer is on the way. All right, basically it just says, just as the signs to look for, like when you see certain trees budding or certain fruits growing, you know what time of year it is. In the same way, when you see these things, which things? Well, he's told us there's one big sign, the abomination of desolation. When you see that happen, then you can know that within a generation, everything is going to happen, which will include the coming of Jesus.
Yeah.
So that's my view on it. And then I think the next part is really interesting, where he says, no one knows the day or the hour. Well, hang on. How do you say that nobody knows the day or the hour when you just told us that when you see this happen, Daniel said 1,290 days later, the end will come? Well, that's where I would say, well, I actually think he's talking about two different comings, if you will.
Yeah.
One is coming for the church,
which is 1 Thessalonians 4.
Right. Yeah. And then the second coming is the parousia, meaning the second coming of Christ.
Yeah.
Now, he talks about them in opposite order, which I think is fine. I'm just saying that's why I think that they both describe different world circumstances. One describes, terrible things happening on the earth, a time of great tribulation like has never come before. The other one describes life as normal. People are marrying and getting married just like in the time of Noah. So in other words, two very different circumstances under which he comes. And the second one he describes here, which again, I would say chronologically happens first, includes mysterious disappearances. People are together and then suddenly one of them's gone. Well, what is that? Well, that's what we're going to talk about this Sunday. But I believe that's the coming for the church prior to the Great Tribulation.
Yeah, no, it's a lot to get into today, but that's a great outlining of those different views and kind of, how, because you have to have that hermeneutical lens, right? You're gonna read it one way or another.
Yeah.
And I think so I think verse 34 is probably the hermeneutical lens for the preterist view, and
absolutely.
And then verse 15 is probably the hermeneutical lens for the futurist view.
Yes.
Yeah. So those are very, so we have all this stuff, but what is the point? Like, what is the posture we're supposed to have? So, I mean, I think that's kind of, as you read through it, what are we supposed to do with all that? So we read all this, what is our reaction? How are we supposed to react to all of this?
Yeah, and I would say like the preterists and the futurists kind of come to the same conclusion, which is, starting in verse 36, nobody knows when these things are going to happen. Therefore, be ready.
Yeah.
And so, what does it mean to be ready? Well, on the one hand, being ready means, keeping your eye out for certain signs. But the other thing to be ready, what does it mean? It means, well, he says there, don't be like the people in the time of Noah who slept, right? Yeah. Spiritually were asleep. So let your heart be awake, be pursuing the Lord, be alive spiritually, seek spiritual vitality and a living relationship with God. But then, then he says, like a servant whose master has gone away, what's their job? Well, their job is to remain faithful with what they've been entrusted with until the master comes again. Yeah. And I think that's the thing that I think some people get so focused on trying to figure out the signs. Jesus explicitly told us not to focus on that. He said, look, I'm going to come back. Here's some signs. Don't be caught by surprise, but also don't be focused on this. The focus needs to be on the Holy Spirit's going to come upon you, and then you'll be my witnesses. Yeah. And I've entrusted you with certain things until I come again. And it's required of a steward that they be found faithful. So I think that's what it means to be ready. It doesn't mean to say, okay, I got my bags packed and I'm ready. What does it mean to be ready? It means to be actively engaged in God's work today.
Yeah, no, I think that's just a great place to end this is Acts. You brought it up on Sunday, and I also brought it up. It's like what they're asking about the signs, and Jesus is like, nothing to see there. Basically, he's like, you're going to receive power and the Holy Spirit has come upon you, and you will be my witnesses. Jerusalem and all Judea and Samaria and to the end of the earth. And, then when he said he went up, and then what does he say? That the same way that you see him go, he will come back. The angels. And so that's really what we should be focused on. We're going to receive power, and we're going to be, and as I was studying, I just saw so many correlations between Matthew 28 and Matthew 24. The Great Commission, ties a lot of same words that Jesus used. I'll be with you until the end of the age, and all these things. And so it just kind of reiterated or solidified that idea that we are to be, as you said, be doing the Father's business, be doing those things He's entrusted us with. And not only that, He will be with us. He's given His Spirit to us, and not to be anxious, not to be worried about signs and wonders and these kind of things that might be happening around us, but to be about, but I think it's difficult. As as I was studying for the first 14 verses, I mean, literally that week, Iran and Israel shooting missiles at Iran, and Iran shooting back, and the Chinese, the Russians are saying we're seconds away. They use that, we're seconds away from World War III, and you're like, and people were genuinely anxious about what was happening. And it was just kind of a perfect thing. Well, what is our posture in the midst of all that? It's to be even more about because the time is near. As these things, it's not we get more afraid, we get more involved in what God's doing. Yeah. So, great thoughts. And so next week, can continue, and it's just going to keep getting better. And we're going to be talking about the tribulation a bit.
Well, really what we're talking about in this next passage is like, how do you live ready for Jesus' return? Right. And then he kind of continues that with some parables that we'll talk about after that, which is like, how to be ready for the end of the world. So
there we go. Yeah. How to be ready for the end of the world. That is what we're going to be talking about on Sunday. So you definitely want to tune in. So join us, and we will see you again next week. God bless.